Good morning. So, we were talking about environmental scanning last time, and we started talking about the sources of factors in the environment that impact us as marketers, right? And I told you that everybody is a marketer at some level because marketing is pervasive social activity. We do it constantly. So these are the factors that are going to affect you, and these are the things that will affect you as you go into the job market. So social trends, economic trends, technological trends, competitive and regulatory. And one of the things I did in terms of bringing my technology is I did bring my Meta Ray-Bans this morning. So I can talk about those. So we'll look at each of these factors. We started talking about this last time. We talked about the fact that the world population is increasing, right? We live on a planet that has about 8 billion people, and that's increasing. We live on a planet that can really comfortably support about 3. So we're going to have to find ways of dealing with that. And marketing is going to play a role in that, right? Logistics and getting supplies and food and necessary items where they need to be is a huge part of marketing. So the world population is growing. The US population is still growing largely as a result of the fact that we've had an influx of immigration. However, among Americans that are born in the United States, we are getting older because, as I suggested to you last time, the number of people having large families is not prevalent anymore, right? People are not necessarily having the number of children that they used to have in the past. When I was a kid growing up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, I mentioned this, it was not uncommon for the families that I knew and the children that I went to school with to have 4 and 5 siblings. That is very uncommon today, right? So the percentage of people having just one kid or no kids is increasing, which means that the US is getting older. So we're going to have to figure out ways, and marketing is going to play a big role in this, and how we deal with the productivity gaps that we're going to have in society. We are becoming more diverse. When I first started teaching here at UCO, the population of the student body here at UCO was fairly homogenous. It was largely first generation students that were coming to UCO that were from, 3 or 4 counties that surrounded the Oklahoma City metropolitan area. And that was not atypical until maybe the last 10 to 15 years that I've been at UCO, that we've had a increase in the diversity, and it is becoming enormously more diverse. When I started teaching at UCO, the average age of our freshmen was 29 years old. So it was mostly people that were going back to school, maybe as a result of the fact that they'd been in the workforce and they figured out that they needed a college degree. And now the average age of our freshmen has dropped significantly. So we've got a lot more diversity. And we talked about the fact that there were generational cohorts. And for the first time, we have a huge number of generational cohorts. It used to be 4, it's probably now 5 generations that are in the workforce all at the same time, because we have a lot of people that are not able to retire because people are living longer. And if you only relied on Social Security, as things have gotten more and more expensive, a lot of those people have had to go back to work. So we have an interesting, unique mix in the workforce, and that presents challenges. One of the things that's different from my grandparents' generation is that they sort of lived to work. They liked to go to work. They wanted to go to work. They enjoyed what they did. You all, for the most part, the reason that you go to work is to provide for the things that you want. And it's not necessarily because it's all of your identity that's wrapped up in the activity that you perform. And we talked about that when we talked about the differences between sort of jobs, careers, and callings, right? Culture is an important part of marketing and understanding the culture that you are working in. We talk about culture at a macro level. So, for example, in the United States, we have a different culture than they do in other parts of the world. What are some of the things that are sort of indicative, do you think, of American culture as opposed to culture in other Western nations? So Western nations would be Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy. Western Europe, Japan is considered a Western style nation. What makes us different from some of those other countries?
On a microeconomics level,
Not a macro level. What, like as a nation, why are we different than say Canada, for example?
I think a big thing for me is over consumption.
Over like a huge percentage of like a very consumer centric society. Yeah, there is a author named Elizabeth Cohen who wrote a book on consumerism and how consumeristic we are and how it's impacted our political culture in this country. And she talks about the way that American consumerism has largely driven public policy in the United States. And that's true. We're far more consumer oriented than other countries. Again, when I was a foreign exchange student in Germany, the father of the family that I lived with was a very high ranking sort of civil servant. He was the equivalent of a superintendent of public instruction in the little town that I lived in called Zost. And I mentioned this before, he had like two suits, one that he wore and one that was, to be cleaned. And if you looked at his closet, it was pretty bare. If you go to the typical American closet, anybody have just one or two articles of clothing, like one to wash and wear? No, we have literally probably, dozens and dozens and dozens of items. Now it's odd because we end up, it seems like, wearing the same items over and over and over again, right? And then you have your favorite hoodie. I noticed that when students come in, they come in the same sort of hoodie every day. Or maybe they have 10 of the hoodies that they're trading out, right? That are all alike. But we have a very consumer oriented culture that's much more materialistic than other places. We have a much more individualistic outlook in this country than they do in other countries. Why is that? We're a fairly large nation. And as we grew and as we got sort of crowded on the eastern seaboard, we just moved west and found new places and new areas to develop. So there's still a huge amount of space in the United States. It's one of the few places that you can actually buy lots of land and move out if you want to get away from your neighbors, and people do that. That is very typical of Oklahoma, by the way. People move outside the city limits so that they can do what they want, where there's no, for example, in the county, there's generally in most counties in Oklahoma, no sort of restrictions on zoning and what you can do. You can build whatever you want out in the county, whereas if you live in town, there are going to be all kinds of restrictions on what you can build. And in various locations, for example, in Guthrie, there's a requirement that if you build a single family home, it has to have a garage. Don't know why, but that's one of the requirements. Does this make any sense? I don't know, particularly given the fact that Guthrie is a historic city and most of the homes don't have garages. But if you want to build new construction, have to have a garage. Don't want to do that in the country? Don't have to. Want to build a shop? You can do that without, asking for permission from anybody, by and large, on the whole, for the most part. So that's one of the things that's very typical of American culture, which is not typical of other Western European nations, where they don't have the amount of space, they don't have the land. When I, again, was a foreign exchange student in Germany, it's a small country, there's lots of people. Home ownership, the idea of home ownership was not something that most middle-class people thought about. They were perfectly comfortable with renting for their entire lives. Whereas most Americans, part of the American dream is to buy a home and own your own little plot of dirt, right? So culture is enormously important, and it impacts the way we buy and the things that we buy. In the United States, again, home ownership is a huge deal. Almost everybody wants to own a home. That just was not typical in Germany because most people, lived in cities. They couldn't afford a home. They rented apartments. So that's something that's different about our culture. What makes our culture different, for example, in Oklahoma? So we have a macro level culture, which is the United States. And part of that culture, when I used to teach American national government, I had my students write a paper called My American Dream, which is very typical. We talk a lot about the American dream in politics in this country. And what is the American dream? Well, for most people, it's home ownership, right? And it's achieving a middle class status. It's having the car and the boat and the house and the kids and all of those kinds of things that you don't necessarily find in other cultures that they have. And again, when I lived in Germany as a foreign exchange student, nobody ran around Germany saying my German dream, right? That they didn't say things like that. But in America, we talk about that. We talk about the American dream and what that is. For most Americans, it's also making a lot of money, right? I mean, that's one of the things that we have a tendency to prize and value in our society more so than they do in other parts of the world. So we have this American dream that's a macro level sort of cultural phenomenon that we share. And you'll find that from New York to California. Now, not so much in New York City, because people in New York City are, if you were born and raised in, for example, Manhattan, you're probably never going to own a home. And I remember I had a partner in a business that I owned, and she lived in Manhattan. At the time, she was 59 when we started this business. And she came to visit me in Oklahoma, and I lived in Edgemere Park at the time. I had a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, historic Tudor home with hardwood floors throughout, a kitchen, dining room, formal dining room, living area with Pullman ceilings. And she was like, how many millions of dollars did this cost you? And I bought this in, I think, 2001. And I paid like $145,000 for that house. And she was like, 145. She had just bought her first condominium in a high rise in New York City. And it was 900 and something odd square feet. And she paid $1.1 million for it. And so, like if you live in New York City, probably not home ownership. But if you get anywhere outside of New York, outside of the city, in upstate New York, people want to own homes. That's what it's more typical that everybody owns sort of their home in the smaller upstate towns in New York. That's even a feature there. In California, that's a thing is people want to own their own home. So that's a national sort of cultural identity that we have that's important in terms of marketing. What makes us different in Oklahoma, say, from New York, though? What do you think makes us unique here that's a marketing opportunity or challenge from, someplace in like California or New
I
York?
would say the freedom of the state, like you have so much more opportunity to do like whatever you want to do as to where you live in New York or California, something like that. There could be totally different laws, or California and New York is all like, besides outside of New York, it's more,
There's
really restrictions.
There's a lot of regulation in California and New York that we don't have in Oklahoma. My brother lived in upstate New York for a long time because of his job, and then he got transferred to Dallas because it was really odd. He went to work for Goldman Sachs as a tax attorney, and they had this other tax attorney that was born in Albany, New York, and they transferred him to the Dallas office, and he absolutely hated it. I mean, he absolutely hated everything about Dallas, starting with the fact that unlike upstate New York and Albany, Dallas is really, really hot in the summer, like exceedingly hot. And he just could not deal with the heat. And my brother was in the Saratoga Springs office of Goldman Sachs, ACO's office, and in upstate New York. And he didn't really like the weather in New York. When you start with 6 feet of snow in the middle of September and it lasts until May 1 or more. At one winter that I was up there, I was there like in May, right after we got out of school. I went up there with my mother, and they still had 6 feet of snow on their back porch. That's like antithetical to the way we live here, right? I mean, he hated it there. The guy in Dallas hated it. So they basically swapped offices. I don't know why they ever thought it was a good idea to send somebody from upstate New York to Dallas. He just absolutely could not stand the heat or the culture in Dallas as well. So my brother moved to Dallas and went to work in the office there. And that guy went back to New York. Completely different, right? And lots of regulations in New York. You have to, my brother's first house in Saratoga Springs, if you, it had one, like, room for one car in the driveway. So when we'd go visit, we would have to park on the street, and you have to move your car every other day because they snow plow one side of the street every day, and then they snow plow the other side the next day. So you'd have to move your car back and forth. And if you didn't, it was a huge fine because it completely disrupted their snow plow system. It was like a $500 fine if you didn't move the car to the appropriate side of the street on the days that they were gonna, do either the north side or the south side of the street that he lived on. Big difference. If you wanted to build anything, do anything, the regulations are much, much more strict in places like California and New York. I believe that as part of the building codes now in California, in residential housing, single family residential, it's either on the slate for adoption or they have adopted it in most communities in California that you have to have fire suppression in new build housing. What does that mean? Well, when you go into a restaurant in Oklahoma, you have fire suppression, right? You have the sprinkler systems that you see. Those are enormously expensive to install. In a home, it will be between $50,000 and $75,000 to add that. And that's something that California is requiring, I think, of all new home construction if they haven't already. That will be a long time coming in Oklahoma. Why? That's just like socialism, right? Communism, to tell people what they have to have in their own home. We do, but it's far more restrictive. So yeah, there's lots more regulations. My brother is a hunter, loves to hunt. In New York, you can't just carry your weapon like you can in Oklahoma. When I was a kid going to school in Oklahoma, I didn't know a whole lot of kids who didn't have a gun rack in their truck. Right? I mean, people in that was not atypical. They don't let you do it now. They don't let you come onto school property, but you would go out in the parking lot when I was in high school, and there would be lots of trucks with gun racks and a rifle or shotgun. And people would go hunting before class in the morning. That was not atypical when I was growing up. You don't find that in New York. That's a difference. So those kinds of things, those micro level cultural aspects are also important when we think about marketing. What does that mean? There's a lot more opportunity to market, things like firearms and stuff like that in Oklahoma than there is in New York, where it's much more heavily regulated. To get a gun permit in New York is much more onerous than it is in Oklahoma, and to get hunting licenses is much more onerous. That is one of the things that I have seen, though, that has changed in Oklahoma in the amount of time that I have been teaching. When I first started teaching, I used to ask people a couple of questions, throughout the semester based on sort of our local culture, like how many of you grew up on a farm or had a member of your family that was involved in farming? And overwhelmingly, 15 years ago, when I would ask that question, everybody in the room would raise their hand. They may not be involved directly, but their grandparents, for example, owned a farm in Oklahoma or something like that. Almost nobody does anymore. And when I ask how many people are hunters in my classes, the number of people who are hunters has decreased dramatically. So it's an indication of how that national culture or other places are starting to impact, I think, even in Oklahoma, because we're seeing less and less of that kind of culture even here in Oklahoma and Texas. I've told you all before that, for example, I'm the chairman of the Guthrie Edmond Regional Airport. And one of the things that flies into Guthrie a lot is a state of Oklahoma Department of Agriculture helicopter that they hunt wild boar. We have a wild boar problem in Oklahoma. They are destroying hundreds of acres of farmland and cropland in the state of Oklahoma. And the state actually hires people to go out in these helicopters and hunt wild boar from a helicopter. I don't think I would ever find that in some place like New York, right? Just shooting from a helicopter. In fact, in many states, hunting from a vehicle is illegal, but it's done here in Oklahoma, right? So economic factors, macro, gross domestic product. The United States is currently the world's reserve currency, right? People don't want to trade in, the currency, the Mexican peso. They want to trade in US dollars largely. Will that always be the case? I don't know. Why did we become the world's reserve currency? That happened after World War II and the Bretton Woods Accords. Great Britain actually wanted for the pound sterling to be the world's reserve currency, but it wasn't. I ask what backs up the dollar. I always have students that will say gold. That is no longer true. Richard Nixon floated the dollar in 1973. So what is it worth? It's worth whatever anybody's willing to pay for it. It floats on a world market. You can see what the price of the US dollar is against other hard currencies like the yen, the euro, or the pound sterling, right? Income is important. So when we talk about income, we have gross income. When you get your pay advice, most of you have direct deposit. Does anybody in here get what's called a live check? And what is a live check? Well, it's like you actually get a physical document that you take to your bank and deposit, although you don't have to do that anymore. With Check 21, you can now deposit your check from your phone. Most institutions will do that. You actually get a live check. Like they actually give you a check.
Yep.
And you know how to deposit it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, my bank's all the way in San Antonio, Texas, so I deposit it mobily.
You deposit mobily. That's different. That's a new phenomenon. This mobile banking is within the last 10 years. Lots of small banks still didn't have it even 5 years ago, but most of them have now adopted mobile banking. So you can take a picture of the front of the check, the back of the check, and deposit it, right? When I was a kid growing up, they actually used to the cutoff date or the cutoff time for most banks in Oklahoma that were outside of the Oklahoma City area was something like 3 o'clock, because the bank would have to bundle all of the checks that they received and send it down to the Federal Reserve in Oklahoma City, where they were then routed through a clearinghouse, and the clearinghouse would then clear the checks and transfer money and things like that. Now we can do that electronically. It's much faster. It happens through an automated clearinghouse, so it no longer has, but we would actually do that. My mother owned a business starting in, well, she owned a business from way before 1986, but she started a business in Oklahoma in 1986. And every month, at the end of the month, we would get back the entire checks that we had written for that month in a big fat envelope. They would process all of them. They would void them out, right? You'd see all these stamps on the back of the check, and then they would send those back to us. Now you just get an image of it because it all goes through an electronic clearinghouse, right? So that is changed. But when you get this live check, or you get your direct deposit, you'll get something. If you get a live check, there will be a pay stub on the bottom of that live check. You get a pay stub on it that breaks out your pay and all of the deductions that are taken out, the federal withholding, the state withholding, FICA, which is payroll taxes, and then any other benefits that you get from your employer, like health, dental, vision, things like that they may deduct, if you have an employee share, right? If you get a direct deposit, that's called a pay advice, usually, and they will give it to you. And a lot of those are now sent to you electronically, probably from your employer, and it has the same kind of breakdown, right? So at the top, it will give you the gross pay, that's the total amount that you make. And then you have all the deductions and you get your disposable income, which is what is left over after taxes and all of that stuff, right? That is taken out. So you need to know the difference between gross, disposable, and discretionary income. Discretionary income is the amount that is left over for luxury items that you have, things that, you know, your entertainment budget and things like that, right? So if we're thinking about marketing things like food stuff, it's very different than marketing things like, you know, Meta, Ray-Ban glasses, right? This is completely, does anybody need these? No, nobody needs these. Are they useful? Yeah, right? I can, you know, say, hey, Meta, let's see if it'll do it. Half the time it doesn't recognize my voice. Hey, Meta, take a photo. Hey, Meta, take a photo. Battery 89. All right. So I just took the photo. We'll open up the Meta app and we'll see. It'll take maybe a second to pop up. I didn't take a photo of anybody. I took a photo of the door. We'll see if it will pop up here in a minute. Anyways, does anybody need this? No, it's useful. It's helpful. It allows you to take photos, connect to Facebook, take live streams, go live, all this kind of stuff. That's really cool. It's not a necessity. But things that we don't think of as being necessities today may be necessities in the future. When I was in high school, nobody had this. I was one of the few people that had a cell phone, right, in high school. My mother got me, I really wanted a cell phone. She got me a cell phone. At that time, it was a bag phone. They weighed like 7 pounds. You plugged it into, it had a battery that would last for, if you were talking on it, for about 15 minutes. It would be active and able to receive calls for about 6 hours, and then it would die, right? So the minute you got in your car, you plugged it into the cigarette lighter, which is something that most cars don't have today, right? And there was this 12 volt outlet in your car that you plugged stuff into. There was actually a device in the car that came with it that would light your cigarettes, because God knows we all smoked back then, right? So we had the cigarette lighter, you pull the cigarette lighter out and you plug your bag phone in, and that's all it did. Was it was just a phone. That was a luxury in 1990 when I got my first cell phone. Today, is a cell phone a necessity? I think for most people, what it was a luxury in 1990 has become a necessity. Everybody had a landline back then. You had a house phone, right? And it's incredible when I think back, I probably knew off the top of my head 150 different phone numbers, because you didn't have a phone book. This bag phone that I had did not have a phone book with it. You had to know numbers. There was this thing that you had, every town had one called a phone book, and people's numbers were listed in the phone book unless they requested that they not be listed in the phone book. And so you knew all of your friends' numbers, and you knew the numbers of the businesses that you frequented, right? Nobody does that anymore. Nobody has a landline anymore for the most part. This has gone from being a luxury in 1990 to being a necessity. If you want a phone, by and large, most people have this. Why? It's cheaper, it's more convenient than a landline. It has a phone book in it, so you can put, it's amazing to me how many people don't, when I take students on sales competitions, which Sinead talked about, I'm like, can I get your phone so that we can, like, I can text you? And they're like, I don't know what my phone number is. They're like, they have to look. I've had students that didn't know how to find their phone number on their cell phone. Why would you need to know that? You don't actually talk on it, right? I guess they figure out how to get their friends' phone numbers so that they can text or whatever. But it's amazing to me how like you just don't know anybody's phone number. I still remember phone numbers. Like I said, of businesses that I used in Guthrie that still have the same phone number. You knew your parents' phone number, you knew your home phone number, you knew, your parents' work numbers, all of your friends' numbers. Don't do that anymore because you've got this device and you just, tell Siri or whatever OS you're using to pull up that number and you'll say, hey, Siri, call so-and-so, right? So you don't have to remember anybody's number. This has become not a luxury anymore. It's really become a necessity for most people because the way we communicate has changed radically from 1990 to 2024 or 2025, right? We've changed radically. So what used to be a luxury item is now a necessity for most people. And it's really helpful. Again, when I was a kid traveling back and forth, going back and forth to New Mexico, if you broke down on the side of the road, so my father lived on a ranch in northern New Mexico, and I would travel back and forth. And if you had a flat tire or anything like that, you either changed it yourself or you walked to a town that had a phone booth. The last time I taught criminal law and procedure, there's this case, very famous case that involves a phone booth. And my students were raising their hands and they're like, Grant, what is a phone booth? I'm like, there used to be these things on every street corner in towns that you would go to and you'd put a quarter in it and you'd pick up the handle and you would dial a number, or you'd go through the phone book that was provided and you would call. We don't have them anymore. They're gone, right? They're completely a relic of the not too distant past. And so what used to be a luxury has now become a necessity. And it's really helpful. If you break down on the side of the road, if you have a flat tire, you can now call, Siri will call AAA for you or whatever and send somebody out. They don't even, I mean, like cars, some of the cars today, again, everybody when I was a kid growing up knew how to change a tire. Cars came with a jack and a spare tire in them. My sister-in-law has a Tesla. If you have a Tesla, you can't change the tire. The car doesn't come with a spare tire and a jack. Because the car is so heavy, you can't jack it up. You have to call Tesla to come get you. They were coming up from Dallas to visit me about 2 months ago. They got a flat tire and could not change the tire. Couldn't happen. Car's way too heavy. So they had to wait for Tesla to send someone out from Oklahoma City to pick the car up and haul it to the Oklahoma City Tesla shop here to replace a tire. Again, that was completely different than when I was growing up. If you got a flat tire, everybody I knew how to change a tire. Any of you know how to change a tire? A few of you? Don't buy a Tesla. You can't do it, right? Now, maybe in the future they'll have it so that it jacks itself up or does something like that. But yeah, that was a skill that almost everybody had that a lot of people just don't anymore. It's become, what was just sort of a standard thing is no longer, part of it. We're just so used to being able to call emergency roadside service that it's changed in many respects. Technology is obviously a huge thing. It's not just social networks anymore. it's mobile marketing. It's an enormously advanced way of getting to where we are, and AI is going to play an increasingly larger and larger role in marketing. Businesses use it all the time. It's incredible to me what we can do. One of my partners in a business that I own was like, I asked AI, I asked ChatGPT to come up with a slide deck for one of our events. And here's what it came up with in less than 30 seconds. And she sent it to me, and it was incredible how accurate. I mean, we had to do very little editing, how accurate it was, how slick it was. It was really, really impactful. So this is going to radically change the way we engage in things, right? So again, going back to when I was a kid and first learning how to use computers, and you actually had to kind of know some code. The first computer that my family bought, you actually had to know how to do things. If you wanted to do word processing on the computer, you had to give it commands to get it to do things, to change the font size. You would have to, for example, if you wanted to center something on the page, you would click at, and then you'd put in a open parentheses, center, close parentheses, and then followed by the words, and it would center it on a sheet of paper, rather than just clicking on the icon that says center in Microsoft Word or whatever word processing you're using, right? So that's becoming more and more prevalent. AI is taking over and doing that, so you don't really even have to do that. Biotechnology is increasing in importance. And so all of these things are going to impact technological advances, the way we market, and it's going to change radically. It's changed radically in the last year, right? I mean, in the last year, we've seen a huge increase in AI. You now probably, have gotten calls. I know I have. I've had this number forever. And it used to be that you could tell when you were getting a robocall. It was real obvious, right? It's less obvious. It was real obvious if they were using an automated system. It's less obvious now that companies are using automated systems, although most of you don't call. Like, why would you call when they've got a chat feature, right? You'd rather use the chat feature than actually talk to somebody. So it's changing enormously, and the power of that is going to be incredible in even the next 6 months. I think we're going to see a radically different change in the way we're doing a lot of business functions. The competitive environment is important. So what kind of environment are you in? Let's think about this as you go out into the workforce. Are you in a pure competition where there are many people competing against you for the same job? Right? Again, I try to make this relevant to you as you think about these things. So one of the reasons that I became a marketing professor, I had no desire to get a PhD in marketing. I had this law degree. I worked in the office of the legal counsel here at UCO, and I left UCO to go into industry and become an executive vice president and chief general counsel of a publicly traded company. And about 5 minutes after I took that job, I knew I hated that job. I mean, I absolutely hated it. It was not at all the kind of work environment that I was used to. My first day on the job, what I was used to doing was coming to UCO, going to my office. I taught part-time. I had kind of a hybrid contract. And so I would, go teach classes. At that point in time when I was hired, we had 7:30 in the morning classes. I know that you all can't imagine that. It was a very popular time when I first started teaching here at UCO 27 years ago. We would have these 7:30 in the morning classes. Why did we have those? Because we had a lot of people that would get in a class before they went to work in the morning. right? So again, our population, our student body population was older than it is now. Again, the average age of our freshmen was 29. They would want to get a class in before they would go to work in the morning. So we had these 7:30 in the morning classes that met on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So 50 minutes, you could get to work by 9, right? If you had that. So I would teach a class like at 7:30 in the morning. I remember on 9/11, I was teaching a 7:30 in the morning class when I walked into the communication building, which was where my class was that semester. And I walked past the television and watched the first plane fly into the first tower of the World Trade Center, right? And I walked in class and I said something like, I think something's happening. I think you all should go home and turn on the news and watch that because I think this is going to be a major event. And I was correct, right? And then minutes later, the second plane hit the Twin, and then the whole nation shut down as a result of those terrorist attacks to get all of the planes out of the sky. So everything shut down. So how did I end up with this PhD in marketing? The reason I'm telling you about this in competitive is one of the things that I did when I left UCO and became a general counsel for a publicly traded company. I realized pretty quickly that I didn't want to do that because I wasn't going and teaching a class at 7:30 in the morning and then going to a committee hearing and doing all of these things. I was stuck in an office, which I had never been stuck in an office the entire time I worked at UCO, because I would go and do student conduct hearings, I would do employee grievance hearings, I would do termination hearings. So I was like literally in my office, maybe a couple hours a day, but the rest of the time I was out. I did mediation. So we have a lot of employees here. So I was out walking around. I get this job at the American Education Corporation. And like my first day, my boss was like, welcome, we're glad you're here. Here's your office. And by the way, here's like 35 RFPs we need you to look at and figure out how we can do sole source. And so like there was a stack of like RFPs on my desk that was literally this high. And all I did was sit there and look at contracts and RFPs for the next 5 years. And I hated it the very first minute. So I thought, well, I want to go get a PhD so that I can go back to teaching and go back to a college campus. That was my goal. My bachelor's and master's were in political science. And so I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go get my PhD in political science and I'm going to go teach political science. And I had this friend who said, you don't want to do that. He was a college professor here at UCO. His name was Daryl Gage. And I said, yeah, I think I do, Daryl. I think, I really miss this. We owned an airplane together and we were flying around. And I said, I made an enormous amount of money and I had no time to spend it. I had no time to fly my plane, anything like that. So I said, I think I really do, Daryl. And he's like, no. He's like, I agree. You want to become a college professor. You don't want to be a political scientist. And I said, yeah, I think I do. That's like my passion. I love politics. That's what I got my master's in. And he's like, if you do that, you will be lucky to get a job. The last time they advertised for a job in political science at UCO, there were 300 applicants for that job. That's pure competition. He said, if you get a PhD in marketing, there are 12 jobs for every newly minted PhD. 12 jobs. Not 12 people applying for the jobs, there are 12 jobs. And the average starting salary that year was $120,000 a year. And so I thought, maybe I do want to get a PhD in marketing. And no love. I'm like probably the only person on the planet who went into a PhD program and endured it with absolutely no interest in the topic. None whatsoever. None. But I endured it because A, I wanted a job. I wanted to make 6 figures. And I wanted to not face pure competition where you had all of these people that were vying for one job that didn't pay a whole lot of money, right? So pure competition, you've got lots and lots of sellers. What is an example of pure competition? Well, there are lots of people who sell, gasoline in the Oklahoma City metropolitan area. We have lots of independent Now it's becoming less so, right? As things like OnQ and Loves and the others are sort of taking over, but lots of gas stations are still independently owned and operated. You can find lots of different, stations. There's Shell stations. There's, again, Loves. There's, BP, things like that out there. And so the price of gas is, generally speaking, within a few cents any place that you go, right? You can get on apps and figure out where the cheapest gas is, but it's pretty much going to be within a few cents in a geographic area, because there's lots of people that sell. And if one gas station is too high, right? I mean, it's a pure commodity. You don't care, for the most part, where you get your fuel, right? You just want the lowest price, right? Monopolistic competition. You have many sellers that compete with substitutable products. This is like the beverage market. If you go out on 2nd Street East towards Arcadia, there's a restaurant out there called Pops, and they have all of these different kinds of soda that you can buy. They're small batch, made from various producers, some that are local, to ones that are coming in from other places, that are just not huge. That's not Coca-Cola, it's not Pepsi, right? But with regard to soda, it's all a substitutable product. What's another substitute for that? As we've gotten to the point where we recognize that this is probably not healthy for you, you can use Diet Coke to clean the battery cables in your car. Imagine what that's doing to your inside. Right? So what are other products that people, water. I never thought that we would pay more for a gallon of water than we would pay for gas, but if you figure out the price, like bottled water, we're all drinking more of that. Now there's all these alternatives in bottled water. So people don't like water because it doesn't taste like anything, right? So there's all these flavored waters or vitamin waters or things like that. In oligopoly, you have few companies that compete. Aircraft production, for example, there are very few companies at a commercial level that compete in the market. You have, in the civilian aviation side, you basically have two. Boeing, right? And the Airbus company from Europe. Those are the two that basically produce civilian aircraft for airlines. Not very many. In the general aviation industry, there's Textron, Cirrus, and that's pretty much it. So Textron owns Cessna and Beechcraft. Cirrus has, Cirrus. They have the Vision Jet, the SR-20, the SR-22. But in terms of certified aircraft, that's pretty much it. There's not a lot. Now, there are more that are not certified. So one of the aircraft that I fly, the Steen Skybolt that I own, which I use for aerobatics, is a home-built aircraft. It's an experimental. You can buy these kits and build them yourself. And they're not certified aircraft. And there's a few more of those, but still there's not a lot that are in that industry. You've got a very small number. And then you can have pure monopolies. Generally speaking, in the United States, because of the Sherman Antitrust, we don't allow at a national level for pure monopolies, but we do in certain areas, in regional or local areas. So for example, utilities are generally pure monopolies. If you live in Edmond, you can't just dig a well in your yard and get water. Now, there are all of these signs up, as you come into Edmond, billboards that say, get free water. And then you have to look at it. It says, for irrigation, you cannot dig a well on your property in Edmond and start using that water for your house, in spite of the fact that we're on the Garber-Wellington Aquifer, and there is groundwater available, right? Why is that? Because Edmond has a monopoly on it. You are required to have your house hooked up, if you live in Edmond, to Edmond Water. you are required to buy, you can't decide that you want to buy your electricity from OG&E because it would be cheaper in Edmond. You have to use Edmond Electric. That's just the way it works. It's a monopoly in those areas. In the city of Guthrie, that's one of our primary sources of income is water and sewer, along with sales tax. You have to be on city water if you live inside the city limits of the city of Guthrie. That's one of our requirements. Can't just dig a well and do it yourself. So pure monopolies. They don't exist. They're generally broken up at a national level if a company gets too large, and they have to go through, if they're a big company and they're buying up something and they think that it's going to be anti-competitive, the federal government can break those companies up. And the vigor with which we do that depends on largely the administration. So, some administrations are more vigorous in trying to break up monopolies than others. It'll be interesting to see what the Trump administration does in terms of regulating the competitive environment. Right? In the electric car market for a long time, it was a monopoly. If you wanted an electric car, you had to buy a Tesla. That's changed. There are more and more cars that have entered into the electronic car market. There's Rivian. GM produces an electric vehicle. I believe there's an all-electric Cadillac that GM produces, but for a long time it was pretty much Tesla. The regulatory environment. So international, lots of businesses are engaged in international. Again, if you went back in time to when I first started teaching, there were lots of businesses that may just have been purely intrastate. So when we talk about the United States Constitution, in Article 2, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, there's a distinguishing factor made with regard to commerce and who can regulate it between interstate commerce and intra-state commerce, right? So, and it used to be that this was a big distinction in our country, and international maybe didn't play so much of a role. If you went back to the 1960s or 1970s, lots of companies may have operated in a completely, within the confines of the United States. They weren't engaged in foreign trade at all. That's no longer the case. Almost every single thing is in some way engaged in international trade now. We don't produce a lot of the stuff that you use every day. Again, if you went back to the 1950s, lots of the clothing that was worn was manufactured in the United States. There were large textile producing companies located in the United States. Even when I was a kid growing up, for example, being a farm kid or a ranch kid, one of the things that we wore were Wranglers. I got in my student evaluations one year, because I came in from feeding horses one morning and I was wearing boots and Wranglers, and one of my students put in my student evaluations, "Don't you know that Wranglers are outer than out?" Really, we're going to make comments on fashion, so I wore Wranglers. There was a Wrangler plant when I was growing up here in Oklahoma. Any Wrangler plants left in the United States? Where did that plant go? When they signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, that plant went to where? Mexico. Yes. The North American Free Trade Agreement was an agreement that was signed by Bill Clinton between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, right? So it went to Mexico. No Wrangler plant, but there were still jeans that were made in the United States at that point in time. So if you're going to engage in international trade, obviously regulation is going to be incredibly important. One of the things that we're seeing with the new administration is part of that regulation is, are we going to impose tariffs on that? And that obviously affects the cost of goods, right? So then we have the national, at the national level, and again, I talked about the layer cake versus marble cake, which I've talked about before in here. Lots of stuff that used to just be regulated by either the state or the national government is now double regulated, right? So forever and ever and ever, the national government didn't regulate a lot of stuff in terms of commerce, because most commerce was pretty simplistic for most of our nation's history. It didn't involve interstate boundaries, but if it did, Congress could sort of regulate it. All of that started to change. What we've seen is there's been sort of three great things that have led to the increase in regulation at the national level. One is the civil rights movement. You wouldn't think of the civil rights movement as being a big deal in allowing the federal government to regulate stuff at the national level, but it was. In the 1960s, the Congress passed something called the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which impacted the private market. So in 1954, the United States Supreme Court, in a case called Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, in a unanimous decision, the United States Supreme Court, under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren, desegregated public institutions. So before Brown, in most southern states, the states or the local governments and private industry operated under what was a system of Jim Crow laws, which segregated people based on racial identities, which are not terribly useful, right? There's really, the use of the term race is not a terribly useful thing. There's only one human race from a genetic standpoint. Now we can talk about ethnicities, but whatever, right? The government recognized that there were various races, again, not terribly useful from a practical standpoint. And they segregated on the basis of these categories, right? And so African Americans were not permitted to go to schools in the same schools as as white Americans, right? And in that case, so this is under a doctrine called separate but equal, which was established in Plessy versus Ferguson. And the court says in that case that these categories are inherently unequal and they will never be equal. And it leads to the desegregation of public accommodations, but it only applied to governmental entities. Brown only applied to governmental entities. Then we get the Kennedy administration, who is committed to the civil rights movement in the United States. John F. Kennedy is shot in Dallas, Texas during his first term, at the end of his first term, and his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, takes over. He was a Texan, by the way, and he is committed to ensuring the legacy of Kennedy's administration goes through. And it's doubtful as to whether or not Kennedy could have gotten the civil rights bill passed, but Johnson could, because Johnson was a master of the United States Senate. And so he passes the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, and this regulates civil rights in private accommodations. So now the federal government is saying you can't discriminate under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In things like restaurants and hotels. And there are two seminal cases that come up. So there are sister cases, the first of which is called Katzenbach versus McClung. 1964 case. And Heart of Atlanta Motel. Versus the United States. So Katzenbach versus McClung involved a small southern barbecue stand called Ollie's Barbecue Diner, I think. And what they said in this case was, look, we shouldn't be subject to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because all of our business, we're not involved in interstate commerce. We're only involved in intrastate commerce. We're a local restaurant that is not a tourist destination. We're off the beaten path. We only serve locals. We don't, we're not involved in tourism. We shouldn't be subject to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Supreme Court in that case said, oh, but you are involved in interstate commerce. Because where'd you get your ketchup packets? Who's the major manufacturer of ketchup packets in the United States? It's a company called Heinz, right? You get the ketchup packets at McDonald's, they generally say Heinz on them. Right? Where did those come from? Didn't come from Atlanta. They came from New Jersey. Therefore, you're involved in interstate commerce. Where did you get your meat? Probably didn't come from just wholly within the state of Georgia. Therefore, you're involved in interstate commerce. Heart of Atlanta Motel, they said the same thing. The Heart of Atlanta Motel was not a chain. It was a locally owned motel. And they said, we're not involved in interstate commerce. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you are. When people travel, they have to have some place to stay. So you're involved in interstate commerce. The result of these two cases in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is that if you look at Congress's power to regulate under Article 1, Section 8, it's very limited. You have to make some case that the impact that you are having is involved in interstate, not intra-state commerce. After Heart of Atlanta and Katzenbach versus McClung, there's almost nothing that isn't involved in interstate commerce that the federal government can't touch if they want to. So we went from being largely regulated, for example, in things like restaurants and health and safety, to being regulated by the federal government, right? One of the reasons, as a result of these civil rights cases, the federal government becomes much more active in regulating things like food quality through the FDA. Before these cases, you could have said all of my food comes from, it's all grown locally. This is a popular movement, by the way, to go back to sort of, there are these restaurants that are opening up that are doing all of their stuff sourced locally, right? They're doing all local sourcing for their menus. There was one in Oklahoma City called Cultivar. I think it's gone broke. They're trying to source completely locally. In the past, before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you could have said, I'm not subject to the FDA's regulation. Now, the court says, yeah, that's tourism. It impacts, right, things, so you could be subject. So we've got all this regulation, and then at the state level, you're also regulated. If you want to open a restaurant, not only are you regulated by the FDA and the USDA maybe, you're also regulated by the state health department, right? So we have this overlapping model of federalism that impacts regulation in many, many, many ways that was antithetical to the way things were regulated and the ease with which businesses could operate prior to about 1964. So one thing that has increased the regulatory environment has been the Civil Rights Act. The second has been the impact of the transitory nature of our population. People, was, again, if you go back to the 1950s and 60s, people sort of lived where they were born. They didn't travel a whole lot. That's no longer true. We're now crossing interstate boundaries. People work, across state lines now as a result of working from home, right? So that has changed. And technology is the third peg that's allowed for a huge change. So I'm out of time. You need to join a group. Is there any group that wants, because we're going to do a group project probably on Wednesday. So is there any group that wants a new member? You guys, you'll take him? All right, so you wanna get with them and then send me an email so that I can add you to their group on D2L. If you got ducks, come and see me in the stop the string.